One of the greatest challenges of the historical biopic is having to mold a disjointed reality into a thematically and stylistically consistent narrative. It's a translative act that almost always results in some detriment to the real history, to the movie, or to both. Yet it is also a revealing one, for it betrays the tension between what we want the past to be, what we want life in general to be, and what it actually is. Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer embodies this contradiction in intentional as well as unintentional ways. A year after its release, the movie remains as enigmatic as the tormented character at its center. A dense historical account of science and politics injected with the scale and energy of an action blockbuster. An invitation to peer into my soul, as one of the first lines of the script reads. Yet an experience that alienates more than it connects. As Nolan himself realized during production, the closer we got, the more obscure the picture became, like a newspaper photograph becoming incoherent under magnification. It is no wonder then that the movie has proven to be difficult to engage with, and that people have called into question various aspects of its story and its execution. But then again, it might also be the sign of a movie still waiting to be truly understood, to be truly appreciated on its own terms without being forced into some pre-existing mold, only to be judged for not fitting. Because what I think you need to understand first and foremost about Oppenheimer is that this is not some journeyman's account of the creation of the nuclear bomb. No, this is a Nolan movie. And today, more than anything perhaps, I want to really examine what that means, or rather, what it has come to mean. Because I do believe Oppenheimer doesn't fully open itself up, for better and worse, until viewed as the culmination of a cinematic vision that Nolan has been aspiring to for many years. A cinematic vision that, to his credit, does unite the movie's many disparate elements into a somewhat coherent framework. Though it's also one that renders it into such a rigid singularity, which in turn makes it more difficult to find a good entry point for a discussion about it. Because to understand the way the movie is structured, you first have to understand the thematic driving force that gives it meaning. But at the same time, this meaning is also a direct product of the structure which provides the necessary vocabulary to formulate it. And so, I guess the best approach is not to pick some point in this circular pattern and make a loop in the hope of finding the story along the way, but to first try and envision the circle in its totality. This video is brought to you by Mubi. Go to mubi.com/likestoriesofold for an extended free trial. Oppenheimer opens with the myth of Prometheus, who, as the on-screen text reads, stole fire from the gods and gave it to man. For this, he was chained to a rock and tortured for eternity. The connection between the ambitious scientist and the mythological figure is obvious, to say the least. The movie explicitly equates the two as Oppenheimer brings into the world a power of godlike proportions, and he clearly spends the rest of his life being punished for it.
You are an American Prometheus.
And it's perhaps because of this obviousness that the metaphor tends to be glanced over as a little more than a mood-setting parable, and as an almost expository hint as to what Oppenheimer's story is about thematically. But at the risk of overreading its significance, I do believe the Promethean myth, and its notion of eternal punishment, is embedded deeper into the movie than generally given credit for. Not so much as a direct allegory, but more so as a gateway to help us understand the movie's structure, its presentation, and the overall experience it offers. It's a strange thing the way we think of eternity, as conscious beings who are bound by a single temporal dimension, in which the arrow of time pushes us in one direction from the past into the future. Eternity is often imagined, albeit vaguely, as an endless following of that movement, turning the years into ages, the ages into millennia, and so on forever. Infinity as an open-ended, ever-expanding temporal mass. But in Nolan's cinematic universe, time is rarely restricted to that rigid linearity. As we've seen, it can bend, it can squeeze, it can be inversed, often resulting in more of a circular movement, both within the story itself as well as within the structure through which it is told. In Oppenheimer especially, which, like Memento, has multiple opposing timelines converging in the middle to create a virtually endless loop. The perception of the story changes significantly when you really consider the implications of this temporal approach. For what it entails, basically, is that if time is a circle, then eternity is endless repetition. It's like that Nietzschean concept of eternal recurrence, which suggests that the moment we die, our lives start over again right from the beginning and play out the exact same way. Nietzsche posed it as such. What if someday or night a demon were to steal after you in your loneliest loneliness and say to you, "This life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh must return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned over again and again." Like Nolan, Nietzsche is not making a literal proposition here about the scientific nature of our reality. Rather, the concept serves more as a thought experiment to make us look inward and to consider our life and the way we are living it. For as Nietzsche argued, by assuming eternity is simply the endless repetition of our own existence, everything we did within it suddenly gains a cosmic significance. And if this thought were to gain possession of you, as Nietzsche continued, it would change you as you are, or perhaps crush you. The question in each and everything, do you want this once more and innumerable times more, would lie upon your actions as the greatest weight. This, I think, is the full meaning of Oppenheimer as Promethean myth, as a biographical account that is both rooted in concrete history as well as completely unbound from it, that still looms over us like a specter doomed to retrace his steps, to tear his world apart only to reconstruct it and do it all over again. An endless cycle of fission and fusion. Why does this matter? What do we learn from this? Well, for one, it helps us to better understand the movie's presentation and overall experience, which has also been a point of contention. As we've come to expect from a Nolan movie at this point, Oppenheimer was clearly made for the big screen, a big and bold cinematic experience filmed in large part with giant IMAX cameras to heighten both the grandeur and the intimate into mythic proportions. As far as presentation goes, Oppenheimer is an undeniably beautiful movie. It even won the Oscar for Best Cinematography. And yet, when asked to point it out, the exact source of its beauty is not immediately apparent. For putting the raw image quality aside, I don't think Oppenheimer is particularly good looking in the same way that movies like Dune or Killers of the Flower Moon are good looking. You know, that every frame a painting kind of way where you can pause a movie at any given moment and be treated to an awe-inspiring vista or some evocative composition. Even compared to Nolan's previous movies, it's kind of a struggle to find any individual shots in Oppenheimer that really stand on their own, that are truly beautiful when taken in isolation. And I think this is largely because those movies featured more adventurous locations to make up for Nolan's by now well-known lack of stylization and cinematic romanticism. Inception had the folding of Paris, it had Limbo and the other dream worlds, Interstellar had strange distant planets, wormholes and black holes, and Tenet had its globe-trotting movement and atmospheric secret worlds as an intrinsic part of its international spy story. But with most of its runtime taking place in mostly unremarkable locations, offices and laboratories, Nolan wasn't really able to rely on such natural visual interest aside from a few nice shots here and there, most notably the ones in the desert, though even these never amount to anything we haven't already seen done more beautifully in other movies. Scrutinizing Oppenheimer up close like this also reveals other flaws in Nolan's presentation, like that aspect ratio that still keeps shifting without consistency or any real narrative motivation, or the lack of attention to properly blocking and framing individual shots. There's a great video from the channel MovieWise that offers a detailed breakdown of some of Nolan's lackluster compositions, like this one, where multiple actors are awkwardly bundled up in the center without using the space on the margins. To demonstrate how this could have been done differently, he compares it to this similar shot from Killers of the Flower Moon, which does utilize the full range of the frame, to an obvious better looking result. In another example, he shows us a rack focus from Spielberg's Lincoln, a shot in which our focus moves from one subject to another, and then puts it next to this one by Nolan, where you can immediately tell the shot doesn't work because Cillian Murphy's head is in the way, and by the time we do get to see the character sitting behind him, the focus is already pulled back to the front. This is not to make the presentation seem worse than it is, for the most part in fact, as the MovieWise breakdown also observes. The camera work is fine and each shot mostly achieves what it set out to do. But the point is that it all seems serviceable at best, which begs the question, where then does Oppenheimer's beauty come from? Well, if we look at some of the movie's most striking visuals, the visions of the quantum world, the nightmares of a nuclear holocaust, and that auditorium sequence where Oppenheimer starts losing it, the primary quality here is movement. The impact comes from swirling atoms, raging fires, and shaking realities. It recalls the temporal inversion from Tenet, which also fundamentally had to be experienced in motion, and which Nolan therefore saw as the closest he got to pure cinema. Because what is a movie, after all, if not a moving picture? And if we assume this perspective, the most fundamental quality, or rather the main instrument that a filmmaker can employ, becomes rhythm. It's the director as conductor, dictating flow, tone, and tempo. It is true that Nolan's movies have been becoming increasingly symphonic for a while now, with Dunkirk and Tenet especially relying heavily on mood, atmosphere, and that distinct musicality that, more than plot, character, or anything else really, dictates the flow of the story and defines the essence of its experience. In fact, there's been a notable reappreciation of Tenet recently as audiences, after initially being somewhat confused by the movie, have grown to love it for what it is, and will often refer to that quote, "Don't try to understand it, feel it," as a sort of mantra that opens up the best way to experience the movie. If anything, Oppenheimer refines this cinematic philosophy even further, as Niels Bohr says to Oppenheimer at the very beginning of his journey.
The important thing isn't can you read music, it's can you hear it. Can you hear the music, Robert?
It is, without a doubt, the clearest articulation of how to understand and appreciate Oppenheimer. Personally, it has even made me look back more favorably on Nolan's previous works, because whereas the Tenet quote to me felt a bit too much like a call to just turn off my brain and mindlessly enjoy, the equation to music invokes a different, more deliberate mode of engagement, one that is more about being in the moment rather than reaching a certain destination, and one in which greater familiarity often results in greater enjoyment. It explains so much about how I, and many others I imagine, keep returning to Nolan's movies over and over again. And while it doesn't necessarily alleviate Nolan's presentational flaws, nor his punctuation issues which I talked about in my discussion on Dunkirk and Tenet, the issues that tend to make his movies feel a bit clunky and overwhelming on a first viewing, it does at least clarify what the sacrifice is really in service of. It's not about offering you a one-time consumable package, but a true cinematic experience that grows on you over time, and which doesn't bring its true value into focus until after multiple viewings. I understand it's a big ask, and a bold move on Nolan's part, as it would be for any filmmaker, to rely on audiences making such an investment. But for me, it was definitely a rewarding one. I saw Oppenheimer 3 times before it fully clicked with me. I really liked it on the first go, but I saw it in IMAX with the big screen and the big speakers all but literally blasting the movie in my face. It was overwhelming in a way that leaves you kind of numb, as if your brain doesn't know which part of the experience to process first. The second time on a regular theater screen, I liked it more, but I also noticed my mind was still computing, still putting together the pieces I missed the first time around and forming an opinion about them. It wasn't until my third viewing, on a relaxed sofa in a small art house venue, that Oppenheimer fully clicked with me, or at least gave me the experience I would also have during subsequent rewatches of the movie at home. At this point, I was no longer trying to parse the movie, but like a piece of music, I could just sort of instinctively attune myself to its flow and let its current carry me along, which significantly transformed the experience for the better. I'm not sure what exactly the emotional or psychological dynamics behind all this look like, and why some movies seem to demand more time than others to connect with them. It might also be too soon to say where Oppenheimer will land for the general audiences in this regard, as we've seen with Michael Mann's Miami Vice, for example, a movie that was largely dismissed upon its release in 2006, but that, like Tenet, is currently being increasingly reappraised and reappreciated. It's a process that can take many, many years. I wonder then if Oppenheimer will go down a similar path. I hope it does. At the same time, however, I recognize that Nolan's creative choices here come with some serious trade-offs that for some might be difficult to come to terms with. By insisting on his vision of pure symphonic cinema, Nolan exchanges legibility for density, moments of quiet for an almost continuous score, and plot comprehension for sensory engagement as traditional scenes are transformed into what feels more like a series of montages. The real question, however, or rather the main struggle that I've seen people had with this, and that I've wondered about myself, is not so much whether this approach is intrinsically good or bad, but whether or not it was the appropriate one given the subject matter. We are, after all, dealing with real history here, a complicated and destructive history, the trauma of which, both from the inflicted violence on Hiroshima and Nagasaki as well as from any future threat of nuclear conflict, still hangs over us to this day. It naturally raises questions like, shouldn't there have been a greater focus on the Japanese victims? Shouldn't the movie have included real historical footage, as we saw in Judgment at Nuremberg? Or reach out to the audience more directly, as that ending of The Zone of Interest did? In short, was Oppenheimer tasteful and thoughtful enough? I don't think there is an easy answer to this, but to inform one in either direction, I do think we have to understand one other aspect of Nolan's filmmaking philosophy that is often overlooked, which is that, for better or worse, all his movies exist firmly in their own cinematic reality. To explain what I mean, we can draw another comparison with Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon, which has strong thematic parallels with Oppenheimer as it also presents a real account of a dark chapter in American history told largely from the perspective of the perpetrator, but which nevertheless went about it in an entirely different way. On a purely presentational level, Scorsese has never refrained from rooting his movies in our actual history, often including a variety of formats, whether real or recreated, to invoke that sense of reality. In Killers of the Flower Moon 2, we see plenty of old-timey photographs and film reels emphasizing that all this did indeed happen. And more than that, at the end, Scorsese directly confronts his audience with the complicated fact that they've just watched a representation of a traumatic chapter in Native American history for entertainment purposes, and implicates himself as being the main facilitator who made it happen, not as a means to sidestep any potential criticisms, but rather to deliberately provoke them, and make that conflict part of the text of his movie. It's essentially a way of breaking the fourth wall. And this is exactly what Nolan absolutely refrains from. His works, as provocative and political they can be, never cross that boundary between the screen and the world outside of it as Scorsese's movies do. We see it in the little things. Nolan's movies always have original musical scores. They very rarely include existing songs or classical pieces, anything that someone might already have an association with. There's never any stock footage or real historical material. There is that one time he pulled some interviews from a Ken Burns documentary for the opening of Interstellar, but these were repurposed for a different context, appropriated, as it were, to the historical reality of that movie, rather than being a direct link to ours. In this sense, he does clearly care about invoking a strong sense of realness, which is also reflected by his preference for practical effects and this overall grounded approach that never gets too flashy. But again, it all serves to establish the reality of the movie, not to build a direct bridge to ours. And that's fine. It's a fair stylistic choice and a valid approach to filmmaking. In fact, I think it has been an important, albeit underappreciated reason why each Nolan movie is welcomed as such a cinematic event. It's because he presents his stories with this almost mythological elevation, presents them as reflections of our world, but still as a mirror reality, with their sacred boundary in between. But again, the flip side of this is that most likely, Nolan never even considered including real historical footage in Oppenheimer or making the audience self-aware through some other form of direct or indirect fourth wall breaking, as doing so would simply contradict the basic principles of his filmmaking philosophy. Whether that's an admirable sign of his dedication, just the predetermined outcome of an uncompromising vision, or a token of artistic stubbornness, I'll leave up to you. Although I will say that while I generally admire Nolan's resolve, I do feel like he can at times be too rigid in his approach, especially with his insistence on practical effects in favor of CGI, which in Oppenheimer was arguably pushing its natural limits. Let's zoom in for a minute on the movie's central set piece, the grand explosion of the first nuclear bomb. Overall, it's a beautifully crafted sequence. The run-up is filled with rising dread and anticipation towards that pivotal moment we all know is coming. And the sound work especially, with its thematically relevant delay between action and reaction, which is also referenced in that haunting auditorium sequence, is nothing short of brilliant. And yet, the actual detonation, while not being bad by any means, still left me wanting a little bit more, both as an immediate sensory experience and as the monumental turning point in the story. It was but a small gap between what we got and what I think the moment needed. A small gap that wouldn't be worth talking about if it wasn't just big enough for Nolan to reveal his presence as the magician behind the illusion. Because if the Trinity test is supposed to be the grand, terrible moment in which Prometheus steals fire from the gods, and in which Oppenheimer not only dooms himself, but also sets in motion, as he later laments, the destruction of the world in its entirety, this is the moment we should be staring into the absolute face of cosmic horror. And yet, because of Nolan's insistence on practical effects and capturing as much as possible in camera, it kind of looks like what it actually was. A big pyrotechnic explosion. An impressive one, sure, but still an imitation. To be fair, Nolan's imagery does look somewhat accurate compared to the actual footage of the blast. And he might have been fighting an uphill battle here considering how the public's perception of the nuclear bomb is now most often associated with the aesthetics of the much bigger hydrogen bomb. But still, if you look at some of the descriptions of the Trinity test, a searing light with the intensity many times that of the midday sun, or as the real Oppenheimer himself said about it, if the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the Mighty One. Then I can't help but feel we needed a little bit more here. A dash of David Lynch perhaps, who did embrace CGI when he filmed the same nuclear explosion for his show Twin Peaks. While I wouldn't necessarily say his overall scene was better, it was a very different approach for an ultimately very different story. When it comes to that specific element of capturing the unholy terror of this pivotal moment, the shattering impact of reality being quite literally torn apart on an up until then unfathomable level, then yeah, I'd have to say Lynch takes the cake. All that being said, as much as Nolan's rigidness and dedication to realness may hold Oppenheimer back in some minor areas, it also undeniably elevates it in other, arguably more important ones. Nolan is absolutely uncompromising when it comes to capturing the real history that surrounds his troubled protagonist. I firmly believe that in the hands of any other filmmaker, this story, with all its complicated and radically transforming political context over the course of multiple decades, would have either been severely simplified or stripped down to focus on but one of the many facets of Oppenheimer's life that we do get to see in Nolan's account. Here I want to briefly talk about composite characters. In the context of biopics or other movies based on true events, composite characters are often used to compress multiple real-life people, usually those that have more of a supporting role in the story, into one fictional character. This is done so the audience isn't overwhelmed by the sudden introduction of a large amount of similar characters, and to keep the story focused on the key players. A good example of this can be found in the show Chernobyl, which at the end explicitly acknowledges how one of its supporting scientist characters was actually a stand-in for the dozens of people that worked alongside the main protagonist. Nolan, however, didn't want to take such shortcuts, which is why, consequentially, Oppenheimer came to include a vast cast of supporting characters. Does this hurt the movie by making it more difficult to keep track of who is who? The more critical voices would probably say yes. But I disagree, aside from the notion that, as we've already discussed, Oppenheimer's symphonic movement somewhat alleviates the need to keep up with its density. I think Nolan makes a good enough effort to distinguish his large ensemble cast by casting a bunch of familiar faces, and by briefly cutting to them each time someone is mentioned. "The gamble I'm taking," he said, "is that you recognize faces more than names." It also helps that many of the supporting characters have their own little gimmick. Like there's the guy with the bongos, the one who can't help but look directly at every explosion, And there's Benny Safdie, who just brings a great presence to each scene he's in, no matter how many other characters surround him. But more importantly, Nolan's giant cast of well-known faces also serves to emphasize just how big of a collective effort the Manhattan Project really was. As the book Unleashing Oppenheimer also pointed out, many of the supporting characters would be Nobel Prize winners in their lifetimes or write books about their work on the Manhattan Project, and nearly every one of them could be the subject of their own movie. To this, John Papsadera, the movie's casting director, also added, "Part of what we had talked about was that these people were giants in their time and in their field. So we worked really hard on filling out the cast with actors who could connote how special those people were in the real world in a very shorthand way." And though I can't really explain why, I do feel there's something special about experiencing the sheer size of all of this, uncompressed. Especially in that first half of the story, there is something strangely moving about seeing so many characters working towards a shared purpose. Seeing all these men and women of science breaking their heads over their collective challenge. It offers a view of humanity that I personally find much more truthful and impactful than if it had just been the one maverick hero with his two buddies. And it was a meaningful decision too, maybe even the most meaningful one of the entire movie. Because what it also does is it pushes Oppenheimer into the background a bit. It makes the world around him feel bigger, more chaotic and uncontrollable, which is also where the real source of dread starts to seep in, and where I believe the movie's primary thematic questions arise. Questions about the real causal forces that drive human history, and about the real agency and responsibility that individuals have within it.
Now it's your turn to deal with the consequences of your achievement.
For me, there's this key main question that hangs over the life of Oppenheimer, Nolan said, which is that no one person invented the atomic bomb. He wasn't the first to split the atom, he wasn't the first to have a self-sustaining chain reaction. But somehow, he's the guy who brought it all together and made it happen in the moment that it happened. How indeed do we judge Oppenheimer? How do we judge the creation of the atomic bomb? Because, as the movie seems to ask us, can we really isolate and judge individual links from their greater causal chains? Is the history of progress not an ongoing event in which each fallen domino is knocked over by the one before it, and subsequently destined to topple the one after it? Is there not a certain degree of inevitability to progress and invention? There's a moment in the movie where the news breaks that the atom has been split, and where Oppenheimer remarks that every physicist on the planet was now thinking about the same thing, one inevitable next step: a bomb. Is it not right here in this very moment that the creation of the nuclear bomb, its terrible applications, and its significance for the course of humanity were already set in motion, that they were bound to happen in some way or another? And better yet, wasn't all this the inevitable outcome of the groundwork laid by Albert Einstein, a man who also seemed to have lost control over his own achievements?
You all thought that I had lost the ability to understand what I'd started.
Or do we go even further back? Was the culmination of 3 centuries of physics, as Rabi feared, always fated to be a weapon of mass destruction? And if so, where will it end? If we, as Nolan firmly emphasizes, can and will lift stones without being ready for the snake that's underneath, then what does this mean for the future of humanity? Are we doomed towards uncontrollable escalation? That is the real nature of Oppenheimer's tragic revelation at the end, right? That's the true reason his entire worldview comes crumbling down. It's the moment when he realized that the forces he meddled with weren't his or anyone's to control. It's the moment
when it became clear to me that we would tend to use any weapon we had.
They are questions of determinism and agency that Nolan has been exploring for a while now. Whatever can happen, will happen, Cooper explains to his daughter in Interstellar. And as Neil repeats throughout Tenet, what's happened, happened. In Oppenheimer 2, a disgruntled Strauss assures his lackeys that he knows Oppenheimer, and decries that if he could do it all over, he'd do it all the same, which feels like a subtle nod to the movie's circular structure looping around over and over again. But they are questions of responsibility and judgment too, because as Nolan phrased it, if a mistake is unavoidable, then is it actually a mistake? Or if someone facilitates an inevitability, do they actually bear meaningful responsibility?
We have no choice.
And this is where we come back to the circle and its fullness. Oppenheimer as American Prometheus, chained to a rock, repeating his life once more and innumerable times more, all in the same succession and sequence. It's where the structure and presentation give meaning to and become meaningful through that endless loop of fission and fusion, letting us experience all at once, past, present and future. It's history reframed in such a way that it renders, as film critic David Ehrlich put it, discovery inextricable from devastation, creation inextricable from destruction, and the innocent joy of theory inextricable from the unfathomable horror of practice. This is not to say that the movie in any way seeks to mitigate Oppenheimer's harrowing accomplishment. It even explicitly states,
"You're not just self-important, you're actually important."
And makes abundantly clear that individual actions still have meaningful consequences.
You don't get to commit the sin, and then have us all feel sorry for you that it had consequences.
But what it does want to do is confront us with the limitations of our common understanding of historical outcomes, and truly consider the implications of this. For if we, as the movie seems to argue, do not and cannot understand the real forces that brought us to where we are, then how can we meaningfully judge history or the individuals who got caught up within it? Or to put it like this, if the powers that move history are too complex for us to grasp, let alone actively exert control over, then doesn't causality become merely a human construct? And aren't truth and judgment but a temporary agreement, a shared consensus negotiated through social, political and cultural discourse? In fact, isn't this the only source of power that Oppenheimer can still wield, or at least tries to wield in the chronologically second half of the story? The power to direct his own narrative. Is this not what is happening here? Oppenheimer weaponizing his persona to exert whatever control he has left, manipulating those around him to influence the world, or at the very least, to negotiate his own salvation.
Did you think that if you let them tar and feather you,
J. Robert Oppenheimer, the martyr,
the world would forgive you?
I gave him exactly what he wanted.
Here the audience also comes back into play. Because while Nolan's filmmaking approach is, as we've discussed, not one that breaks the fourth wall or directly reaches out to his viewers, his mirror realities do often include a sort of in-universe surrogate of them. The Prestige is very much about the audience as the subject of the magician's spellbinding illusions. The team that Cobb assembles in Inception is famously modeled after a filmmaking crew, building dream worlds that the audience is brought into for a transformative experience. And in Oppenheimer, this mirror audience is also there right from the beginning, as witnesses to the trial of Oppenheimer, ready to judge him one way or another. But what Nolan understands here is that the trial is an inherently phony one. As with any biopic, its direction is entirely in the hands of the filmmaker, and its outcome largely in service of the audience. For a condemnation can be its own strange form of propaganda. It's the act of creating a scapegoat that allows us to exhale in relief and proudly proclaim, "Look at how bad this man was for bringing into the world such a terrible creation. He should not have done that." It's a judgment he might deserve. But then again, isn't a judgment always, in some way, a coping mechanism, a cathartic expression of our own desire for meaning, for wholeness? A self-serving delusion that masks the truth of a more disordered and unknowable reality underneath.
Just remember, it won't be for you. It'll be for them.
In this sense, I don't think Oppenheimer really is about guilt either, as many have argued. At the most, it's but the tip of the iceberg of the actual story that is being told here. And yet it's a misunderstanding that was at the root of a lot of the early criticisms that, in some way or another, seemed to implicitly call for the movie to just be more conventional, more legible, and more moralistic. And to be fair, if Oppenheimer really was just the simple tale of man creates bomb, man feels bad, we should judge man for it, then yes, it could have easily dropped that last hour. It could probably have dropped the entire second perspective of Strauss's storyline, and instead included the Japanese victims or something. Either way, it could have been an altogether more accessible and more didactic movie pandering to our general desire for moral simplifications and easy self-righteous judgments. But again, this is not the Nolan way. What he understands and assumes in his storytelling is that we already live in a post-nuclear world. The atomic weapon has been invented. It's part of our reality now as much as any tool in our growing arsenal of violence and destruction. From fighter jets to machine guns all the way back to the bow and arrow and the taming of fire. And as such, from a dramatic perspective, his movie doesn't bring us back to let us pretend we are once again standing on that precipice, like a sort of Schrodinger's cat in reverse, imagining we would have done differently. No, instead, Nolan refrains from such definitiveness, not for lack of courage, but because of the simple fact that, as he said, the more we learned, the less we understood, except for the growing realization that to pass any particular judgment on Oppenheimer is to ignore some aspect of his story. And so, just like his American Prometheus, Nolan turns our fundamental desires against us and throws us in a loop, having us peer into this man's soul over and over, in the hope of a connection that remains forever elusive, and of a resolution that is never offered. We're not convicting, just denying, as the mantra seems to be. It brings us back to Nolan's most essential themes, crystallized here in their most hauntingly poignant expression. The consequences of being trapped within limited subjective perspectives, having to face the fundamental absence of ontological certainty, the absence of a solid reality to hold on to, and the danger of self-corrupting delusions that may seek the light but that are bound to get eaten by hiding the true driving forces in the shadows, leaving us to stare into the void until we find some way to reconcile with it, or doom ourselves to perpetual torment by closing our eyes to it. As I already talked about in my previous discussions on Nolan's movies, his more triumphant ones show how we can break free from downward spirals and destructive self-delusions through awareness and reflection, and through the courage to take a leap of faith and place our trust in the world around us and in the people within it. And as he so explicitly underscores in Inception, cinema can be a powerful tool to help you achieve this, offering transformative and liberating experiences that transport you outside of yourself, that allow you to momentarily break free from the trappings of your limited perception to gain new perspectives. And for the best place to experience such cinematic journeys, I would of course recommend you check out friend of the channel and sponsor of today's video, Mubi. Mubi is a curated online cinema streaming exceptional movies from around the world. They have a vast library of amazing movies from newly emerging filmmakers as well as from established masters, with each and every one of them being carefully hand-selected to provide you with the best that cinema has to offer. As I mentioned in my last Mubi spot, I really enjoyed The Settlers, a savagely bleak yet captivating tale of man's destructiveness set in the empty beauty of the Chilean mountains. But recently I also saw Gasoline Rainbow, which was a beautifully unique road trip movie that wonderfully combined the classic tropes of the genre with the themes and pathos of 21st century modernity. If you want to check these out for yourself or watch one of the many other amazing movies Mubi has to offer, be sure to use my personal link, that's mubi.com/likestoriesofold, to get 30 days for free. Again, that's mubi.com/likestoriesofold to get your extended free trial today.